Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story. Happy birthday to me! That's right. I'm saying it once, I'm not going to say it again. I'm old. Well, not yet. I'm going to celebrate and count until I get 50. Not there yet. I've got a couple more years. I refuse to be old, and I refuse to stop enjoying life as much as I'm physically able to. I'm working on my health. I know everybody's commented on my breathing. I need to see a doctor about my breathing. I think it's a asthma or something, because it doesn't affect me too much unless I'm walking, but I'm working on it, so hang in there, guys. It's a process, and I'm older, so it takes more time to lose weight and get into shape, but I'm working on it. Goals are important. Now that I've done rambling, we have a video from Mr. Bearded Historian, who is going to talk about war again, because that's his thing. And we have a plane race. Airplanes! Line up. Alright, we've got Hiking Ontario, there's Sandra, there's Principal, there's Blistering, Dirk Diggers, Trip, Days Adventures, Mark, M&J, Spectral, Alice, Thorkin, Walter, Cruise Nuts, Jamaican, Six Bows, Crazy Train, Cruise Nuts, Dave, there's Eric, Five Can, Rowdy, Zoe, Brit Girls, Pedro, Win, Sheena, Patty, Louisa, let's see, Susan. Let's see, who's it gonna be? Pedro! Alright, so this is Mr. Pedroza, excuse me. Mr. Pedroza is one of our Johns. Lots of Johns. You need to catch up. What is your comment over there?
Pedro Pascal.
Wrong Pedro.
Pedro.
I'm not helping.
So mean, I don't care.
Anyway, he does a lot of traveling, trains here, there, food, hiking, a little bit of history here as well. So a very supportive dude, very wonderful. I need to catch up. I'm a couple behind, but he's got some great videos and some fun shorts. Check him out. Like, share, comment. Have a good day.
Hello humans, it's another one of our fun-filled weeks for the Bearded Historian and our look back in history. Now, the day we're going to aim at, July 10th, 1940. For those of you looking at the calendar, this was the date that they give as the beginning of the Battle of Britain. Now, depending on who you talk to, the English or the Germans, the Battle of Britain went through the end of October 1940 if you were British, and the Germans actually looked at it a little differently, because they also looked at the time period until May of 1941, which included what's commonly referred to as the Blitz. Now, how this fun-filled event happened to come about, in World War II, the easy part was that the Germans had overran France and the Low Countries in the Battle of France, leaving Britain on its own little island. German High Command knew there was going to be difficulties in launching a seaborne attack, while the Royal Navy controlled the English Channel of the North Sea. So the primary objective for the Germans was to compel Britain to agree to a peace settlement. The British officially recognized the battle's duration again until October 1940, but the Germans don't recognize the subdivision. In July of 1940, the air and sea blockade began, with the Luftwaffe targeting coastal shipping convoys, ports, shipping centers such as Portsmouth. And on the 16th of July, Hitler had ordered the preparation of Operation Sea Lion as a potential amphibious and airborne assault on Britain to follow once the Luftwaffe had established air superiority over the Channel. Well, on August 1st, the Luftwaffe was directed to achieve air superiority over the RAF with the aim of incapacitating the RAF fighter command. Well, 12 days later, they shifted the attacks to the RAF airfield and infrastructure. Well, as battles progressed, the Luftwaffe also targeted factories involving aircraft production, strategic infrastructure. Eventually, it employed terror bombing in areas of political significance and on civilians. Well, in September, RAF Bomber Command night raids disrupted the German preparation of converted barges, and the Luftwaffe's failure to overwhelm the RAF forced Hitler to postpone and eventually cancel Operation Sea Lion. The Luftwaffe proved unable to sustain daylight raids, but the continued night bombing operations in Berlin became known as the Blitz. Well, Germany's failure to destroy Britain's air defenses and force it out of the conflict was the first major German defeat during World War II. Now, to get a good full look at how all this plays together, you got to turn the clock back even further. During World War I, strategic bombing was introduced. Air attacks intended to panic civilian targets led in 1918 to the merger of the British Army and Naval Air Services into the Royal Air Force. Its first Chief of Staff, Henry Hugh Trenchard, was among the military strategists of the 1920s, like Louis Duché, who saw air warfare as the new way to overcome the bloody stalemate of trench warfare. World War I was famous for trench warfare. Inception was expected to be nearly impossible, with fighter planes no faster than bombers. The slogan was, "The bomber will always get through," and the only defense was a determined bomber force capable of matching retaliation. It's kind of like, if you're going to bloody my nose, I'm going to bloody your nose in the process until we knock each other out. Well, predictions were made that the bomber offensive would quickly cause thousands of deaths and civilian hysteria would lead to capitulation. However, widespread pacifism following the horrors of the First World War contributed to a reluctance to provide resources. Well, Germany was kind of in the opposite boat. Germany was forbidden to even have a military air force by the 1919 Treaty of Versailles. Therefore, air crews were trained by means of civilian and sport flying. Following a 1923 memorandum, the Deutsche Lufthansa airline developed designs for aircraft such as the Junkers Ju-52, which could carry passengers and freight, but also could be readily adapted into a bomber. In 1926, the secret Lvivsk fighter pilot school began training Germans, interestingly enough, in the Soviet Union. In our organized rapid expansion, and following the 1933 Nazi seizure of power, his subordinate Robert Noss formulated a deterrence theory incorporating Neusch's ideas and Trippett's risk theory. This proposed a fleet of heavy bombers to deter the preventive attack by France and Poland before Germany could fully rearm. Well, a 1933-34 war game indicated the need for fighters and anti-aircraft protection as well as bombers. On March 1st, 1935, the Luftwaffe was formally announced with Walter Weaver as the Chief of Staff. 1935 Luftwaffe doctrine for conduct of air war set air power within overall military strategy, with critical task of attaining local and temporary air superiority and providing battlefield support for Army and naval forces. Strategic bombing of industries and transport could be decisive with long-term options dependent on opportunity or preparations by the Army and Navy. Could be used to overcome a stalemate or used when only destruction of the enemy's economy would be conclusive. The list excluded bombing civilians to destroy homes or undermine morale, as it was considered a waste of strategic effort, but the doctrine allowed revenge attacks if German civilians were bombed. A revised edition was issued in 1940, and the continuing central principle of the Luftwaffe doctrine was that destruction of enemy armed forces was of primary importance. Well, the RAF would respond to the Luftwaffe developments with the 1934 Expansion Plan A rearmament scheme, and in 1936 it was restructured into Bomber Command, Coastal Command, Training Command, and Fighter Command. The last was under Hugh Dowding, who opposed the doctrine that bombers were unstoppable. The invention of radar at that time could allow early detection, and prototype monoplane fighters were significantly faster. Priorities were disputed, but in December of 1937, the minister in charge of defense coordination, Sir Thomas Inskip, sided with Dowding that the role of the Air Force was not an early knockout blow, but rather was to prevent the Germans from knocking us out, and fighter squadrons were just as necessary as bomber squadrons. Well, a little incident known as the Spanish Civil War, not quite so little, took 3 years, gave the Luftwaffe Condor Legion the opportunity to test air fighting tactics with their new airplanes. Wolfram von Richthofen became the exponent of air power, providing ground support to other services. The difficulty of accurately hitting targets prompted Ernst Ude to require that all new bombers had to be dive bombers, and led to the development of Nickenman's system for nighttime navigation. Priority was given to producing a large number of smaller airplanes, with plans for long-range 4-engine strategic bombers were canceled. Gee, if there was only one country I could think of that made a 4-engine bomber. Now, in the first stages of the Second World War, the early stages, the successful German invasion of the continent, added decisively by the air power of the Luftwaffe, which was able to establish tactical air superiority with great effectiveness. Speed, which the German forces defeated most of the defending armies in Norway in early 1940, created a significant political crisis in Britain. In early May 1940, the Norway debate questioned the fitness for office of the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. In May, on the 10th, the same day Winston Churchill became Prime Minister, Germany initiated the Battle of France with an aggressive invasion of the French territory. RAF Fighter Command was desperately short of trained pilots and aircraft, and Churchill sent fighter squadrons, the air component of the British Expeditionary Force, to support operations in France, where the RAF would suffer heavy losses. This was despite the objections of Commander Hugh Dowding that the diversion of his forces would leave home defenses under strength. Well, after the evacuation of the British and French soldiers from Dunkirk and the French surrender on the 22nd of June 1940, Hitler mainly focused his energies on the possibility of invading the Soviet Union. He believed that the British, defeated on the continent and without European allies, would quickly come to terms. The Germans were so convinced of an imminent armistice that they began constructing street decorations for the homecoming parades of victorious troops. Now, although the British Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax and certain elements of the British public favored a negotiated peace with the ascendant Germany, Churchill and a majority of the cabinet refused to consider an armistice. Instead, Churchill used a skillful rhetoric to harden public opinion against capitulation and prepare the British for a long war. Now, the Battle of Britain has the unusual distinction as it gained its name before it was fought. The name derived from "This was their finest hour" speech delivered by Winston Churchill in the House of Commons on the 18th of June, more than 3 weeks prior to the generally accepted date for the start of the battle. Quote, what General Weygand called the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of the Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and that of the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of a perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so that ourselves that is the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will say this was their finest hour. Now, I'm going to go ahead and throw this out on a limb here because, at this stage, again, Britain is by itself. They have no more allies on the mainland. Spain's neutral, more pro-Nazi than England. Switzerland is its own little island, surrounded by Germans and Italians. And right now, Russia, the Soviet Union, and Germany have a non-aggression pact. So England pretty much is stuck on their little island. The U.S. hasn't jumped in yet. I mean, they do have Lend-Lease, but still. Now, from the outset of this situation, a lot of people will look at the speculation that what if Germany finished off England before going after the Soviet Union? It probably would have been a lot harder to do because, well, the island has always been known as a sticky point to land forces on. Now, Germany, Adolf Hitler expressed the admiration for Britain, and throughout the battle period, he sought neutrality or a peace treaty with Britain. He had a secret conference on May the 23rd. He set out rather contradictory strategy that an attack on Poland was essential and will only be successful if the Western powers keep out of it. If this is impossible, then it will be better to attack in the West and settle Poland at the same time with a surprise attack. If Holland and Belgium are successfully occupied and held, and if France is also defeated, the fundamental conditions for a successful war against England will have been secured. England can then be blockaded from western France at close quarters by the Air Force, while the Navy and its submarines extend the range of the blockade. Well, when war commenced, Hitler and the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, or High Command of the Armed Forces, issued a series of directives ordering, planning, stating strategic objectives. Directive number 1 for the conduct of war, dated the 31st of August, instructed the invasion of Poland on the 1st of September as planned. Potentially, Luftwaffe operations against England were to dislocate English imports, the armaments industry, and the transport of troops to France. Any favorable opportunity of an effective attack on concentrated units of the English Navy, particularly on battleships or aircraft carriers, will be exploited. The decision regarding attacks on London is reserved to me. Attacks on the English homeland are to be prepared, bearing in mind that inconclusive results with insufficient forces are to be avoided in all circumstances. Doesn't sound like Hitler really wants to go poke the English. Now, both France and the UK declared war on Germany. On the 9th of October, Hitler's Directive Number 6 planned the offensive to defeat these allies and win as much territory as possible in the Netherlands, Belgium, and northern France to serve as a base for the successful prosecution of the air and sea war against England. Now, 29th of November, OKW Directive Number 9 instructions for warfare against the economy of the enemy, stated that once the coastline had been secured, the Luftwaffe, together with the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, was to blockade UK ports with sea mines. They were to attack shipping and warships and make air attacks on shore installations and industrial production. This directive remained enforced in the first phase of the Battle of Britain. It was reinforced on the 24th of May, during the Battle of France, by Directive 13, which authorized the Luftwaffe to attack the English homeland in the fullest manner as soon as sufficient forces are available. The attack will be opened by annihilating reprisal for English attacks on the Ruhr Basin. Well, along came the end of June 1940. Germany had defeated the Britain's allies on the continent, and on the 30th of June, the Chief of Staff, Alfred Joel, issued his review of the options to increase pressure on Britain to agree to a negotiated peace. The first priority was to eliminate the RAF and gain air supremacy. Intensified air attacks against shipping and the economy could affect food supplies and civilian morale in the long term. The reprisal attacks of terror bombing had the potential to cause quicker capitulation, but the effect on morale was uncertain. On the same day, Luftwaffe Commander-in-Chief Hermann Göring issued his operational directive to destroy the RAF, thus protecting the German industry and also to block overseas supplies to Britain. The German Supreme Command argued over the practicality of these options. Well, in Directive Number 16 on preparations for a landing operation against Germany on the 16th of July, Hitler required readiness by mid-August for the possibility of an invasion called Operation Sea Lion, unless the British agreed to negotiations. The Luftwaffe reported that it would be ready to launch its major attack early in August. The Kriegsmarine Commander-in-Chief, Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, continued to highlight the impracticality of these plans and said sea invasion could not take place before early 1941. Well, Hitler now argued that Britain was holding out in hope of assistance from Russia, and the Soviet Union was to be invaded by mid-1941. Göring met his air fleet commanders and on the 24th of July issued tasks and goals of firstly gaining air superiority, secondly protecting invasion forces and attacking Royal Navy ships. Thirdly, they were to blockade imports, bombing harbors and stores of supplies. Well, Hitler's Directive Number 17 for the conduct of air and sea warfare against England, issued on the 1st of August, attempted to keep all options open. Luftwaffe's Adelberg campaign was to start around the 5th of August, subject to weather, with the aim of gaining air superiority over southern England as a necessary precondition of invasion, to give credibility to the threat and give Hitler the option of ordering the invasion. Now, the intention was to incapacitate the RAF so much that the UK would feel open to air attack and would begin peace negotiations. It was also to isolate the UK and damage war production, beginning with an effective blockade. Now, following severe Luftwaffe losses, Hitler agreed at a 14th of September conference that the air campaign was to intensify regardless of invasion plans. On the 16th of September, Göring gave an order for this change in strategy to the first independent strategic bombing campaign. Well, in Hitler's 1925 book, Mein Kampf, mostly set out his hatreds. He only admired ordinary German World War I soldiers in Britain, which he saw as an ally against communism. In 1935, Hermann Göring welcomed news that Britain, as a potential ally, was rearming. In 1936, he promised assistance to defend the British Empire, asking only in a free hand in Eastern Europe, and repeated this to Lord Halifax in 1937. That year, von Ribbentrop met Churchill with a similar proposal. When rebuffed, he told Churchill that interference with German domination would mean war. To Hitler's great annoyance, all this diplomacy failed to stop Britain from declaring war when he invaded Poland. During the fall of France, he repeatedly discussed peace efforts with his generals. Well, when Churchill came to power, there was still wide support for Halifax, who, as Foreign Secretary, openly argued for peace negotiations in the traditions of British diplomacy to secure British independence without war. On the 20th of May, Halifax secretly requested a Swedish businessman to make contact with Göring to open negotiations. Shortly afterwards, the May 1940 War Cabinet crisis, Halifax argued for negotiations involving the Italians, but this was rejected by Churchill with majority support. An approach was made through the Swedish ambassador on the 22nd of June that was reported to Hitler, making peace negotiations seem feasible. Well, throughout July, as the battle started, Germans made wider attempts to find a diplomatic solution. On the 2nd of July, the day the armed forces were asked to start preliminary planning for an invasion, Hitler got von Ribbentrop to draft a speech offering peace negotiations. Well, the 19th of July, Hitler made the speech to the German parliament in Berlin, appealing to reason and common sense, and said that he could see no reason why this should not go on. His somber conclusion was received in silence, but he did not suggest negotiations, and this was perceived being effectively an ultimatum by the British government, which rejected the offer. Halifax kept trying to arrange peace until he was sent to Washington in December as an ambassador. In January 1941, Hitler expressed continued interest in negotiating peace with Britain. Well, a May 1939 planning exercise by Luftwaffe 3 found that the Luftwaffe lacked the necessary means to do much damage to Britain's war economy beyond laying naval mines. Joseph Schmidt, in charge of the Luftwaffe intelligence, presented a report on the 22nd of November 1939 stating that of all Germany's possible enemies, Britain is the most dangerous. This proposal for the conduct of air warfare argued for a counter to the British blockade and said key is to paralyze the British trade. Instead of the Wertschmatt attacking the French, the Luftwaffe, with naval assistance, should block imports to Britain and attack the seaports. Should the enemy resort to terror measures, for example, to attack our towns in Western Germany, they could retaliate by bombing industrial centers in London. Now, parts of this appeared on the 29th of November in Directive Number 9 as future actions once the coast had been conquered. On the 24th of May, 1940, Directive Number 13 authorized attacks on blockade targets as well as the retaliation for RAF bombing of industrial targets on the Ruhr. Well, after the defeat of France, the OKW felt that they had won the war and that some more pressure would persuade Britain to give in. On the 30th of June, the Chief of Staff, Alfred Jodl, issued his paper setting out options. The first was increased attacks on shipping, economic targets of the RAF. Air attacks and food shortages were expected to break morale and lead to capitulation. Destruction of the RAF was the first priority, and the invasion would be the last resort. Göring's operational directive, issued the same day, ordered the destruction of the RAF to clear the way for attacks, cutting off the seaborne supplies to Britain. Made no mention of invasion. Well, in November of 1939, the reviewed potential for the air and sea airborne invasion, the Kriegsmarine was faced with the threat the Royal Navy's larger home fleet posed to a crossing of the English Channel, and together with the German Army, viewed control of the airspace as a necessary precondition. The German Navy thought air superiority alone was insufficient. The German naval staff had already produced a study on the possibility of an invasion in Britain and concluded that it so required naval superiority. The Luftwaffe said the invasion could only be the final act in an already victorious war. Well, Hitler first discussed the idea of an invasion on a May 21st, 1940 meeting with Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, who stressed the difficulties of his own preference for a blockade. The Chief of Staff Journal's 30 June report described the invasion as a last resort once the British economy had been damaged and the Luftwaffe had full air superiority. On the 2nd of July, the OKW requested preliminary plans. Well, Britain, Churchill described as the Great Invasion Scare as serving a very useful purpose by keeping every man and woman tuned to a high pitch of readiness. Historian Len Degnan stated that on the 10th of July, Churchill advised the War Cabinet that invasion could be ignored as it would be most hazardous and a suicidal operation. Well, on the 11th of July, Hitler agreed with Raeder that invasion would be a last resort. The Luftwaffe advised that gaining air superiority would take 14 to 28 days, basically about 4 weeks. Hitler met with the army chiefs, von Berchach and Halder, at the Reichsgarten on the 13th of July, where they presented detailed plans on the assumption that the Navy would provide safe transport. Von Berchach and Halder were surprised that Hitler took no interest in the invasion plans, unlike his usual attitude towards military operations. But on the 16th of July, he issued Directive Number 16, ordering preparations for Operation Sea Lion. Though the Navy insisted that a narrow beachhead and an extended period for landing troops, the Army rejected these plans. The Luftwaffe could begin air attack in August. Hitler had held a meeting of his Army and Navy chiefs on the 31st of July. The Navy said the 22nd of September was the earliest possible date and proposed postponement until the following year, but Hitler preferred September. He then told von Berchach and Halder that he would decide on the landing operation 8 to 14 days after the air attack began. The 1st of August, he issued Directive Number 17 for intensifying the air and sea warfare to begin with Aldertag on or around the 5th of August, subject to weather, keeping options open for negotiated peace or blockade and siege. Well, under the continuing influence of the 1935 conduct of air war doctrine, the main focus of the Luftwaffe was in concentrated attacks to destroy enemy armed forces in the battlefield and blitzkrieg, close air support, of the Army succeeding brilliantly. The reserve strategic bombing for the stalemate situation or revenge attacks, but doubted if this could be decisive on its own, and regarded bombing civilians to destroy homes or undermine morale as a waste of strategic effort. The defeat of France in June of 1940 introduced the prospect for the first time of an independent air action against Britain. July Fleer Corps 1 paper asserted that Germany was by definition an air power. Its chief weapon against the English is the Air Force, then the Navy, followed by the landing forces and the Army. In 1940, the Luftwaffe could undertake a strategic offensive on its own and independent of the other services, according to an April 1944 German account of the military mission. Goering was convinced that the strategic bombing could win objectives that were beyond the Army and Navy and gain political advantages in the Third Reich for the Luftwaffe and himself. He expected the air warfare to decisively force Britain to negotiate, as all in the OKW hoped, and the Luftwaffe took interest in the planning to support an invasion. Now, as the battle would progress, like we were talking, the start off proposed 10th as the onset of increased attacks. There were already attacks going on before then. I mean, Germany and Britain were at war. Britain was trying to help France, thusly Germany was trying to stop Britain from helping France. And of course, when Britain pulled out of Dunkirk, all those forces coming back to England, they're going to want to stop the English as much as they could. Although what's funny is they had some felt a golden opportunity to take and push England right out of the war. But they held up at Dunkirk, which surprised a lot of people. They could have done a lot more to hinder the English and basically help them by putting the brakes on, so to speak. But as they were looking, and it's also kind of contradictory, again, with how Germany was. It's almost like Germany was fighting among itself as to who was going to be the stronger of the two. Because if your military works in coordination with each other, obviously you're going to have to find a way to stop the RAF, because without it, the RAF is going to destroy your ships as they're trying to cross the channel. Pretty simple. Your Air Force also has to take into consideration that your targets are going to be on land, going to be at sea. If they're going to be helping a landing force, they're going to need to have that air control, air superiority advantage. All that is going to have to work in tandem with this idea of doing a landing. The thing that's also crazy is that it's not that far of a distance to put the forces across. I mean, you can see across the channel. At the same time, I can bet you everybody and their mother is going to be waiting for you when you climb up on those beaches. Whether they, stick you with a pitchfork or, take a pop shot at you. But England was ready in the streets, in the fields, on the beaches. They were ready to hold back the Germans as much as they could. Churchill, did an awesome job as an orator to lift the English spirit. And at the same time, he was also hoping that the United States would hurry up and get into the party. Of course, that wouldn't happen until the end of 1941. But, I think the biggest problem that they had is that Hitler took too long. And it also goes into play that, Hitler, while he wanted to take care of the English question, is England going to just sit on their island and do nothing? Because meanwhile, on the other side of Europe, you have the Soviet Union. A couple times, Hitler had to go help out the Italians down south, both in Albania, Greece, into Africa, because it's like, Mussolini was a comedy of errors. And so, if Hitler could have concentrated on one front, things might have turned out differently. But it's like every time he got to a certain point, his generals were like, well, no, we want to do this first. No, we want to do this first. And eventually they got to the point where they said, well, let's just call off trying to do a landing, because the time window was so far out of whack. If they could have done it in, early August, late July, then everybody would already be on the same page. But I think the other problem that they also ran into was the Germans, it's almost like they didn't believe in their own army. Here they had done a blitzkrieg that was beautiful. They went through Poland, they went through the Netherlands, they went through Belgium, they took France out of the game. It's really kind of bizarre that Hitler couldn't have done more, but at the same time, you have to give the English props for standing up to a dictator and just not, because Hitler wanted to take the easy way out. He's like, let's get them into a treaty, let's get them into an armistice. Let's get them so that we don't have to worry about this front. And then we can concentrate all our stuff over here against the Soviet Union. And of course, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the day, the biggest problem is that then they said, well, we'll do the Blitz. We'll start bombing night missions. And all that did was it gave the English a resolve to fight harder. And I think that's where Hitler made a critical mistake. That's something called attacking the Soviet Union. But this has been the Bearded Historian. Sue's birthday is today, so we'll catch you guys later. And we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.